Let's say happy Wednesday. No, but happy Monday. It's going to be a glorious week. At least I hope it's going to be a glorious week. But I do spend way too much time on Twitter, and I came across this particular tweet or this trend. James Patterson is correct, but comes off tone deaf. And then, of course, what is racism? Now, my definition of racism is not the current definition of racism because they keep on changing the definition of racism. Seems like every couple of years they add to it. My definition of racism is I have an issue with the term racism. I'll get to that later on. But my definition of racism is when you give advantages or disadvantages to a particular group of people based off of their ethnic background. As in, if let's say I was a company and I hired only white people, that would be considered racism. Now, if I am that same company and I only hire an ethnic background that consists of dark skin and from Africa, that's also racism. But apparently, that's not racism. So let's let's go ahead and kick this off to what I'm talking about. James Patterson, whose popular books have made him a staple on the at USA's best-selling book list for years, laminated that white men struggling to find writing jobs in film, theater, TV, and publishing industry as another form of racism. Now, he is correct, but someone of his stature, someone of his wealth, comes off a little tone deaf. But he may be the right person or the correct person to spread this. Because there are certain people that are getting hired as diversity hires that have no merit in the position that they're in. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it in Hollywood. We're seeing it in Disney. We're seeing it on the news that certain people that are not being hired on merits are writing just trash stories. Perfect example is this article. James Patterson said that white men face racism. He hates seeing publisher drop from Woody Allen memoir. What a terrible headlines. Now this is from Hannah Yasharoff, whatever her name is. This article is pretty much all over the place. I could have written a better article, and I don't even have a writing degree or a journalist degree. James Patterson, popular, blah 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 blah, speaking on the Sunday Times in an interview published over the weekend. Patterson lamented over white men struggling to find writing jobs in film, theater, blah blah blah. What's that all about? He continued, can you get a job? Is it harder? Yes. Is it even harder for older writers? Which is true. The older generations are finding it harder to get a job because regardless of what ethnic background or skin tone you have, older people tend to take a little bit longer. Their work, once you hit a certain age, is different from each people, tend to suffer. And the experience you once have is outdated and no longer relevant, which is why people tend to retire. Now, some people call that ageism, which, we live in a world of isms. But, some people just cannot work anymore for various reasons. And of course, someone had to bring up what he's describing isn't racism because that's not what racism means. But when you keep on changing the term racism, we no longer have unity or cohesion between us now. Some people may agree or disagree, but when you change the terms of words, it kind of breaks what it is, and you have people who are saying racist because they were taught that if you discriminate against people based on the color of their skin or their ethnic background, religion, creed, maybe not religion, but where they come from, that was like the old term where you either reward certain people that fit a certain gender norm or you don't reward people and you discriminate against them, that was a form of racism. Now, I don't like the term racism because it kind of goes against what I believe the human race is. Now, I say ethnic background when dealing with people of a different skin tone or different characteristics, because that's pretty much what we are. Because if we were truly different races, we wouldn't be able to interbreed. We wouldn't be, and have a productive offspring. And what I mean by productive offspring, I mean someone that's able to have other offspring within themselves. So let's say if I were to go procreate with a black person, the child of that relationship will be able to go to an Asian person and be able to create an offspring and return back and forth. So that's not different races, that's just different ethnic background because I believe that it's just the human race. And I think over the decades prior to like 1920 is when the term race was introduced. I think it was in Russia at the time. Could have been Germany, I don't remember. But according to this, a definition is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities or capacities that other racial differences produce an inherent superior or particular race. I don't exactly know what this means, but Latino elites use racism to justify the displacement and enslavement of indigenous populations and those beliefs, along with resentment created by the continued exploration of let's see here, indigenous land and labor culminated the Guatemala War or Civil War in 1960 to 1996. However, we began to undo the process of internalized hatred and internalized racism. Also believe that behavior or attributes that reflect and foster this belief a racial discrimination or prejudice, the kind of trenchant racism in which black people have perceived have been subject can never be defeated by making its victims more respectable. The essence of the American racism is disrespect. Um, so certain behaviors and attitudes, I believe, are more culture based because you could have two groups of people there in the same type of predicament, as in low income and low respect, and have similar outcomes because they don't have the opportunities to explore or to better themselves. And I think it's the culture that breeds within certain that element, especially with the criminal element. It doesn't matter what the skin tone is. If you don't have the opportunity to better oneself or to further oneself financially, you're going to have a culture of crime. I don't think it has anything to do with the ethnic background, although we do tend to see it in one group over another, but I think that's more cultural or generational taught. Then, of course, from racist graffiti in schools, of daily microaggression and the police profiling rally testimony highlights the issue surrounding racism and still very much a local issue. Once again, racially profiling is when it's being used now, it's because there's a high level of crime and the greasy will gets the oil. And I don't really believe in microaggressions. If we're talking about microaggressions, and we're doing pretty damn well if we're getting to that level. And then, like, the most of the examples I hear, or the more prominent example I hear, is a person with a particular type of hair gets asked the questions about the hair because it doesn't look like my hair, and people just have questions about it, which is that's now more of a microaggression opposed to trying to understand someone's genetics. And they could be taught into a teaching lesson saying how some people are born with certain genetics that cause their hair to curl, while others have genetics that cause their hair to be straight. But instead, that's considered a microaggression, because why not? The war on drugs cloaked the race neutral language, offered white rights opposed to racial reform, a unique opportunity to express their hostility towards blacks and black progress without being exposed to the charge of racism. This is really kind of splitting hairs. I know what this is probably referring to because certain neighborhoods were flooded with guns and drugs, and wasn't that they were being prosperous, but actually they were targeted by the police, and we have had documented cases where a white person would get a lesser charge and a black person would receive a harsher charge for the same crime, exactly identical. This happened back in the 1980s and bled through a little in the 1990s, and there was a strong push to make it a little bit more fair, but not. It was just progress or push to make progress in the correct direction. So yes, I do understand that there was been a history of it. And of course, the systematic oppression of a racial group or social to the social, economic, and political advantage of another, specifically white supremacists, but you don't want to say black supremacy because that's an actual thing. But the way that they're changing this particular word, you'll never have a black supremacist against white people because you always want the black people to be the victims and the white people to always be the oppressor. And this is where I'm kind of splitting hairs or just showing my frustration because anybody could be racist towards another group. And I don't really like the fact that white supremacy is being thrown out. I do know it's an issue, I just don't think it's a big enough issue. And institutional racism, which I think we've made progress, I do understand that there's still echoes from the institutional racism that haven't been quelled, but we're definitely hopefully making progress and hopefully we don't overextend and become black supremacy or just racist towards white people. One of the many ruse racism has achieved through the virtual erasure of historical contributions by people of color. I mean, you have a Black History Month. I don't see a White History Month. We even have Pride History Month. Discriminatory housing practice, redlining neighborhoods, underfunding education, lack of access to healthcare, racial profiling, police brutality, and mass incarcerations are just a few examples of cage riders that altogether contribute to structural racism. Yes, I do understand that. Back to what I was saying, that back in the 80s or probably 70s, 80s, and early parts of 90s, you could have a white person and a black person go do the same crime, and the white person will have a lesser punishment. I think we're making roads to better improve that, but also racial profiling could just be neighborhood profiling. Like, say, if you're in the middle of a ghetto, which is a high in crime, police are going to be called out there more often because of the culture of crime that ghettos tend to bring, regardless of the ethnic background that makes that ghetto. Our nation faces a fork in the road and a decision to either continue down the same path of systematic racism or confront our past honestly. People of color and low income people of color, low income people, and indigenous people have been made especially vulnerable throughout the decades in environmental racism policies, the internationally concentrated pollution and toxic hazard in our community. don't exactly know what this means other than if you're poor, you're going to go into the hood, also known as a ghetto. And unfortunately, when you have a ghetto scenario with run-down neighborhoods, they're not the most clean for whatever reasons. A political or social system founded on racism is designed to execute its principles. Here we go. In 1913, Native Land Act reserved 90% of this country for whites, who then made up of 20% of the population under the formalized racism of apart 3.3 million blacks were forcibly moved to isolate reservations called homelands. The economist, I don't know what this is referring to. I don't really know what this means. I have to look more into this. Let's see here. Let's see what Google has to say. Wikipedia. Substantially, the Bantu Land Act of the Black Land Act was an act of parliament south of Africa that was aimed at regulating acquisition land, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, so it's more of African, not necessarily United States. Hence why I didn't know what that meant. Then, of course, we have some more examples. But the thing is, you keep on changing the term, you're never going to fix the issue. And I think in order to fix the issue, we got to cement things down so we could address them. If you keep on changing it, it's just moving the goalpost further and further. I don't know, that's just me. And I can't believe I made about a 17-minute video about racism off of a James Patterson trend. I don't know, leave a comment down below what your thoughts are. Smash the like and subscribe button on all in 80 platforms, or just a platform that you're currently watching. But most importantly, have yourself a wonderful day, morning, and evening.